Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Ontario's surcharge on electricity exports are now suspended, temporarily shelved after a drama-filled day that ended with an olive branch from the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
I've agreed to suspend temporarily, and we always have that tool in our toolkit, until we sit down over the next day or two. I'll be heading down to Washington along with Dominic LeBlanc, and we'll have a good discussion.
Now, if Premier Ford's export tax was meant to send a message, it was received loud and clear by the U.S. president. Introduced yesterday, Donald Trump exposed his anger on social media today, and he threatened to hit Canada back for Ontario's audacity. Trump writing, based on Ontario, Canada placing a 25% tariff on electricity coming into the United States, I've instructed my Secretary of Commerce to add an additional 25% tariff to 50% on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States from Canada, one of the highest tariffing nations anywhere in the world. This will, he said, go into effect tomorrow morning, March the 12th. But that threat now seems to have been diffused, the White House saying it will be the original 25% tariff on steel and aluminum that comes tomorrow. This as Premier Ford agrees to accept Secretary Lutnick's invitation to discuss the issue in Washington rather than duke it out tariff against tariff, at least for now. And late in the day, this is what we heard from Donald Trump himself.
As you know, there's a very strong man in Canada who said he was going to charge a surcharge or a tariff on electricity coming into our country. He has called and he said he's not going to do that. Okay, he's not going to do that. And it would have been a very bad thing if he did, and he's not going to do that, so I respect that.
Stephen McNeil is the former Premier of Nova Scotia. He currently sits on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on U.S.-Canada relations. Mr. McNeil, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
So it's been a very fast-moving day, and the latest we now have is that Ontario is going to remove this surcharge because Howard Lutnick did reach out to the Ontario Premier and invited him to have a discussion about Canada-U.S. trade ahead of April the 2nd. What does that say to you? Does that say to you that the surcharge actually worked here, or that Mr. Ford is taking a step back?
No, I would say to you that it indicates that it's working. We knew all along that the tariffs the Americans were imposing on Canada were going to impact the American consumer much more than here. The 25% means costs in the U.S. going up 25%. And what Canada, both the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, and the Premiers all indicated early on is that what they were going to do was match dollar for dollar on tariffs that would impact Americans, not so much Canada's economy. And what Doug did, or Premier Ford did, was actually basically follow Trump's lead and did a 25% on our energy being exported in the U.S., which means we were directly impacting American consumers. And ultimately, that's who's going to put pressure on the White House to talk to them about the lunacy of this policy, which is everything they're doing is only driving up costs in the U.S.
I think it's worthwhile to dig in with a bit of what you just said, because I think it's fair to say that there are many Canadians that are very worried about this moment. But when you say the tariffs that Donald Trump is going to impose on Canada will actually hurt Americans more, can you dig into that as to how that will persuade the American public to tell the president to step back?
Sure. Anything that we export into the U.S. is going up 25% because of the President of the United States is imposing his own tariff. He, in essence, is taxing goods that are going across the U.S. border to 25%, which means the American consumer is going to get that increase, whether it's potash from Saskatchewan, whether it is lobster from Atlantic Canada. He's driving up the cost by 25%, and that will be borne by American consumers. Because that cost will be passed on, which means cost take place in the U.S. Many Americans understand that, but we can talk about that all we want until they actually feel the impact of it, which I believe they have been over the last week. Then we'll start seeing some movement, I believe, in the U.S.
Okay, some movement, but how bad might this get before it's all over? Because to my understanding, the very threat of tariffs have had an impact on Canada's economy already, and it has already had an impact on Canadian jobs. So how bad can this get? What do Canadians need to be ready for when we talk about a trade war?
Well, first of all, you are absolutely right. Just talking about the threat of a tariff is impacting the Canadian economy. It's impacting investment within inside of our country. So just the conversation is already impacting employment and jobs. And I don't think we should underestimate the anxiety that people are feeling, worried about the next paycheck or worried about what's going to happen down the road. But what I can tell you is that Canadians are unified, understanding this was not something that was generated by the Canadian government. It wasn't something that was done by Canadian business. This was imposed on us as Canadians, whether it's in the public sector or private sector, by the U.S. president. And Canadians are galvanized and ready for what could be a long road. I also think we need to fully grasp and understand this is not going away just with President Trump. I think he's demonstrated a new wave of politics in the U.S. The MAGA movement will be around for a while. I think all the more reason why Canada needs to really diversify our economy and diversify our export partners. The U.S. will always be important to us, but they can no longer be in total control of what's the exports of this country. We need to go out into the world and find markets to do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, there has been a debate about adding an export tax or a surcharge in the parlance of the Ontario Premier on the things that we export to the United States, in particular Canadian energy and minerals. Given what has now happened in the last 24 hours, from the time Ontario introduced this surcharge to the reaction that we had from Donald Trump, to now this invitation by Howard Lutnick to the Ontario Premier to come and talk at the table, what does that say to you about the efficacy of that strategy and how widely spread it should be used?
Well, I'll leave that up to the premiers and the prime minister to decide what they're going to put future tariffs on. But I think clearly Premier Ford demonstrated that he was prepared to use all levers at his disposal. When you're talking about 3 American states that would have been heavily impacted by this tariff, that's a powerful tool to use. I don't think Premier Ford would have used that lightly. But let's face it, the president is attacking jobs all across this country and jobs in the U.S. I think the decision by Premier Ford for him was the right one. We'll see how this all plays out. But I want to tell you, and I hope the American people fully understand this, that Canadians are galvanized. Canadians are in this for the long haul. This is not something that any Canadian government did. This isn't something that happened because if this is being imposed on us, and we will continue to demonstrate how strong Canada is, and there will be impact. Let's not minimize that. There will be impact, but in the long run, this is a call to action by all of us in terms of diversifying our trade portfolios.
Mm-hmm. Diversifying, and you do right now sit on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. Of course, we're about to get a new Prime Minister when Mark Carney gets sworn in. What's your message to him? Because, Justin Trudeau had experience with Donald Trump thanks to the renegotiation of NAFTA. What's your message to Mark Carney, who may not have had these face-to-face dealings with the U.S. president?
So, listen, I was around as an elected official through Trump 1. I think this is very different now. There doesn't seem to be a level of guardrails on the president. But I think Prime Minister-elect Carney, while he may not have directly negotiated with the president, he's certainly been heavily involved in economic challenges at home and abroad. He'll fully grasp what's taking place, and I was very pleased to hear his comments the other night of being, we will match tariff for tariff. And I think one of the great lines that Prime Minister-elect used, our tariffs will not come down until the president starts showing Canadians respect. And ultimately, that's what this comes down to. If you want a deal, Canadians are ready to have a deal. We already have a free trade deal with the U.S., but it requires respect on both sides of the table. And Canadians right now do not feel that the President of the United States is respecting us. And until he does, I think the Prime Minister-elect will have all the support of Canadians to continue down this path until he does.
Stephen McNeil, always appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
All the best. Thank you.
Okay, let's continue the conversation, because ahead of Secretary Lutnick's phone call with the Ontario Premier, we did speak with Peter Van Loan. Of course, he held several ministerial portfolios in the Harper government, including Minister for International Trade. And earlier in the afternoon, we discussed the wisdom of hitting Americans with an energy surcharge for exports and counter tariffs.
Not at all. I think it's important that Canada be responding forcefully, and Ontario in particular has a bit more flexibility to do that. The American response is interesting. The response of the 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Well, American aluminum, 70% of it comes from Canada, manufactured by American companies. And that's going to be very, very difficult for American manufacturers and consumers to absorb. So they'll be feeling the brunt of that. I think it's unfortunate all the way around. But in a tit-for-tat, Canada has to be stepping up and doing its bit to fight back.
But you know, Canada does have the smaller economy of the two countries. Can this country really afford to get into that kind of trade war? Would it be better to just lean into negotiations instead of, as you say, go tit-for-tat against the U.S.?
Well, it would be great if we could have negotiations, but apparently there's none to be had right now. And it may be that what Donald Trump is really just trying to do is advance the process of renegotiating the Canada-U.S. trade agreement, which I think should be done as a bilateral agreement without Mexico. That's the best way of being able to advance our interests. But the fact is that those negotiations aren't to be had, so we have to decide, are we going to stand prone and accept what the Americans are imposing on us? Are we going to make some pain happen on the American side? One of the odd characteristics of this trade war is that until there are actual tariffs on us, Americans aren't feeling any pain. And we're the ones that are quite concerned about it and reacting, Canadians understandably and emotionally to that. Once those tariffs start falling into place, as we're going to see happen with the steel and aluminum tariffs, and then it will spread on April 2nd, the Americans are going to start feeling the pain and the misery of this trade war, in which nobody is a winner. But the last thing we can do is ensure that we're the only losers.
How does this get walked back, though? You know, as difficult as the current situation is, we will always be trading with the Americans. We always have because of our geography. How does this get walked back if we get into this type of trade war, counter tariffs with the United States?
Well, there's no doubt that we depend while I don't accept the notion that we have a trade deficit with the U.S., when you take into account things like services, when you take into account that the amount of crude oil that we send to the States more than makes up for the trade surplus. Americans are getting that at a discount of 10 to 20% on the world price because of the fact that we've had a government for the past 10 years that's resisted creating the infrastructure through pipelines to give us other outlets for it. So Americans get to buy it at a discount, and then they send it down to Houston and get the value added from the refining. So that's not really a trade deficit. That's not us taking advantage of them. That's the United States taking advantage of Canada. So while the rest of it still is fairly balanced, the trade, it is a bigger part of our economy than it is of the American economy. So in that sense, we are more exposed. But that's all the more reason why we have to maintain that trading relationship and do everything we can to protect our position. The problem for Donald Trump is he promised lower prices, no inflation for Americans, and the best ever stock markets. What they're getting is something very, very different. And the more he goes down this reckless path of the trade battle, the more that's going to be the case.
So I wonder what your message is to the Ontario government, to the people of Ontario, because steel will affect Ontario industry hardest when it comes to that sector. What is your message to them? Because I'm sure they're hearing this 50% threat from Donald Trump that will come in place tomorrow and are right now very worried about their futures.
Well, frankly, I don't know how different the 50% tariff is from the 25% tariff that was going to take effect tomorrow. Both of them, I think, would be sufficient to cause serious harm. But what the Americans are going to discover, and Donald Trump is going to discover, I think certainly the ones in industry know it, is that as he moves forward with these things, we're going to see an impact, for example, on the auto industry. Steel and aluminum are big inputs into it. Auto parts are a big input into it. And depending on who you believe within the auto industry, you could see some of those assembly plants in the United States shutting down in 5 to 7 days after he starts bringing in tariffs that affect them. April 2nd for sure, maybe even the steel and aluminum tariffs now. So those are those key people, the blue-collar workers Donald Trump claimed to be supporting. Those are the people who helped deliver him that victory, for example, in the swing state of Michigan. And when they find they're losing their jobs because of Donald Trump's tariffs, they're going to, say, holy smokes, that's not what we voted for him to do. And if you take a look at the first round of Canadian counter tariffs, they've been very intelligently designed so that the kind of things that are inputs into automobiles are not excluded. So when those plants start closing, Donald Trump's not going to be able to turn around and say, I'm sure he will, but he will not be able to truthfully turn around and say that that's because of actions of Canada. It's going to be entirely because of his actions.
Peter Van Loan, appreciate the experience and the insight. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now, we haven't heard from Mark Carney since Doug Ford suspended his energy surcharge, but earlier we did get this post on social media, the Prime Minister-designate saying the following, quote, "My government will ensure our response has maximum impact in the U.S. and minimal impact here in Canada while supporting the workers impacted. My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect and make credible, reliable commitments to free and fair trade." Okay, let's discuss this challenge now before Mr. Carney. Happy to have on the program right now the former Deputy Prime Minister Anne McLellan, co-chair for the Coalition for a Better Future. And thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
So,
pleasure.
So Mr. Carney will be taking over for the Prime Minister sometime soon, expected to be sometime this week. But, this transition is happening while we're obviously in the midst of a pretty brutal trade war. Does that put us at a disadvantage as a country?
I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. First, most of the key ministers are in their jobs, and while I cannot predict whether they'll stay in their jobs in Carney cabinet, if I were to guess, I would say that those key ministers will probably keep their jobs. So what do we see? We see Dominic LeBlanc going with Doug Ford on Thursday to meet with the Commerce Secretary. The Minister of Finance, Dominic LeBlanc, has been involved in this file from the beginning. Probably Melanie Joly will continue to plan for the G7 meetings. She will continue to talk to Marco Rubio, her counterpart. Francois-Philippe Champagne will continue to deal with his counterparts, and so on. So that's one thing, that we will probably have the key name actors and their relationships with their counterparts in the U.S. remaining strong. The other thing is people need to take on board the fact that with Mr. Carney, you have got someone who has dealt with complex, difficult, unpredictable situations and people. He dealt with that issue in 2008 and beyond with the financial crisis when he was governor of the Bank of Canada and worked with Jim Flaherty and Stephen Harper and others. And of course, in the lead up to Brexit and during Brexit, where Mr. Carney made it quite plain as the governor of the Bank of England, he was opposed to Brexit. And again, a very difficult time for the United Kingdom. But what you learn from these events is how to deal with unpredictability, how important relationships are, building those relationships, how important it is to be thoughtful and calm. And I think you see all of that in Mr. Carney.
So, and I hear what you're saying, in a detailed CV when it comes to leading in turbulent times, but is Mark Carney an elbows up kind of guy who can meet Donald Trump, who is a leader that does not follow rules of decorum?
I have never played hockey myself, Michael, but I know that Mr. Carney, I think his favorite game is probably hockey, and he talks a lot about hockey. And I would think, even though he was a goalie, where perhaps you don't have your elbows up quite as much as you do in the corners, I would say that Mr. Carney's a fighter, and that Mr. Carney is not going to have any trouble both getting his elbows up and keeping them up when it is appropriate. But of course, you also need someone who is calm and thoughtful and knows when it's important to put the elbows down and actually, be more thoughtful, get away from simple sloganeering. Mr. Carney is the antithesis of what I call frat boy sloganeering. He's thoughtful. He's been tested in some of the difficult times that countries have faced globally. So I have no doubt that Mr. Carney has the determination and the steel to do what is necessary.
So in terms of a mandate, though, now that we are entering these talks this week, the fact that Donald Trump is not holding back on his threats, the fact that we're facing tariffs on steel and aluminum tomorrow, and by the beginning of April, another round of tariffs for the United States, how quickly do you think Mark Carney will actually pull the plug and go to the polls to get a mandate?
Well, that is not for me to decide, Michael, as you can imagine. So I am not going to opine on when Mr. Carney might decide to go to the public in a general election. I think there are lots of rumors out there that speak to the fact that the House will not come back on March 24th and that the election will very likely be called between today and March 24th. But look, I'm just reading what the pundits and others say. I have no inside track on when Mr. Carney is going to call the election. But if I were a betting person, which I'm not really, Michael, but if I were a betting person, I think it's going to be sometime between today and March 24th.
Okay, so keeping an eye on that. And I appreciate the fact that you don't want to opine here, but I do wonder, will Mr. Carney run as a Liberal in Alberta? You've done it. You've succeeded in the past. You're both from Edmonton. Do you think this is what we're going to see Mark Carney running in Alberta?
Again, I don't know. The one thing I would say to Mr. Carney and the people around him is that Alberta is a very difficult province for any Liberal to win in. And I would also say that dealing with the tariff situation with the United States, obviously, Mr. Carney will have to work with all 13 provinces and territories, and certainly Premier Smith has said some things that might give me a little bit of pause in terms of where she might come from in the coming weeks during an election. And of course, if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, you need, regardless of where you run, you need to be thinking about those relationships and how you sustain and maintain those relationships, because we're going to need them all in the weeks and months ahead. So my bottom line, it's up to Mr. Carney, but Alberta's a tough place for a federal Liberal to win.
And yet you have in the past, Anne McLellan, so good
yes.
words. And thank you for that. I appreciate the time this evening. Always good to speak with Anne McLellan. Now, before we are done this evening, we also want to address Mr. Carney's future, the Liberal leader promising a seamless and quick transition. And to give us an idea of what that actually involves, we did meet earlier today with Senator Peter Harder. He played a key role in Justin Trudeau's transition following the 2015 election.
I think that we can look to the past in similar circumstances, but this one is unique. Let me go first to what's in the past. Where late in the mandate there has been a leadership change in the governing party. That's happened. It happened with Mr. Pearson to Trudeau father. And they took 14 days to have the transition take place, swearing into the new Prime Minister. And he took 3 days to call the election. It happened with from Mr. Mulroney to Kim Campbell. It took 14 days. And she stayed on for, I think, 75 days or so before she called the election. My point is that transitions at the end of a mandate are unique. They're not the start of a new government, not after an election. And I think we're in particularly different circumstances today because of the Trump issues. and the need for the government of Canada to, in my view, have a mandate from the people to deal with this historic shift in Canadian economic and political relationships.
So in your view, it should be sooner rather than later. And that is the expectation, that we're going to have a writ drop sooner than later.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a sense, this is transition light. That is to say, what does the new Prime Minister need to put in place to govern getting to an election? So it's not a big discussion about what does an SFT look like, what's our priority, no, it's what is the cabinet I want to need to put in place to call the election, and in a sense, the broader transition will take place in the course of the election and its outcome.
Okay. You know, the other question I had, because you mentioned the very fact that the transition, the longer transition, is in the course of the election itself. And we certainly know that ministers will have to run for their seats again, but while there is an election, they are part of the caretaker government. And you know, we don't have to go back that far. I'm thinking about the last federal election, the fall of Afghanistan, and it seemed that the government, in the caretaker government, stumbled a bit because they were in the midst of an election campaign to respond to what was happening in Afghanistan. We now are in the midst of a trade war. What do you think this government under Mr. Carney will have to do to ensure that the ball is not dropped in the course of a campaign?
Well, I think I would expect before the writ is dropped that he will have made some announcements and decisions with respect to a whole of Canada approach. That is to say, meeting with the premiers in some fashion, reminding everybody about what the strategy is, what measures are put in place by the Government of Canada to deal with those affected in the course of the tariff war. So I have every confidence that the Government of Canada will do what is necessary and important to protect the interests of Canada even during a writ. The availability for communications will be accelerated because of the nature of the election, but also it will be incumbent on the government and all of the political actors to reinforce the positions that they're taking in the face of the tariff threat. So I suspect it will accelerate the national conversation because it's going to be very focused.
Our thanks to the Senator. Well, that is our program for this Tuesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.